Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This is a conversation with Matthew Lyons, anti-fascist researcher, contributor to Three Wave Fight blog, and the author of, among other books, the 2018 PM Press and Kursplebedeb edition, Insurgent Supremacists, the U.S. Far Right's Challenge to State and Empire, as well as a contributor to the recent AK Press compilation, No Pasarán, Antifascist Dispatches from a World in Crisis, edited by Shane Burley. For the hour, Matthew talks about Christian Nationalist and theonomic tendencies and movements like the New Apostolic Reformation, Dominionism, reactionary Catholicism, and Christian Reconstructionism, in order to learn about how they interrelate or conflict with other far-right tendencies in the so-called USA, as well as the ongoing assault on bodily autonomy, abortion access, and cis-hetero-patriarchy. More of Matthew's work can be found at matthewnlyons.net. We're hoping to bring you voices from graduate students and other workers on strike in the University of California system and possibly beyond that for next Sunday's show. Just a quick announcement, there is still repression being felt by those swept up by the state during the 2021 national strike in Cali, Colombia, and there's a fundraising effort for the Paso del Aguante 6, who are facing up to 50 years in prison for participating in the strike. The Colombia Freedom Collective is happy to announce that Christian Andres Aguilar has been released after 14 months of pretrial detention, though he's not out of danger yet. You can learn more about the cases of the Paso del Aguante 6 and the work of Colombia Freedom Collective and how they are intertwined at colombiafreedomcollective.org, and you can see the recent post about Christian linked in our show notes, and make tax-deductible donations to the support fund. So I'm speaking with Matthew Lyons, anti-fascist researcher, activist, and author of multiple books, including Insurgent Supremacists, the U.S. Far Right's Challenge to State and Empire. Matthew is also a contributor to the upcoming AK Press collection, No Pasarán, and is a longtime contributor to the blog threewayfight.blogspot.com. Thank you very much for joining. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So I've invited you on mostly to speak about the Christian far right in particular, which is one of the focuses in your book, which has been behind increasing and sustained attacks around issues of gender and sexual equality and liberation in the so-called USA, including these ramped up state-by-state erosion of abortion rights, education around sexuality, quote-unquote CRT and other topics, and also the recognitions of non-cisgender folks. In May, you published an article on Three-Way Fight entitled Abortion, the Christian Right, and Anti-Fascism that sort of rehashes some of the content of your Theocrats chapter in Insurgent Supremacists. You began this blog entry with the line, "It's time for anti-fascists to stop treating the Christian right as a secondary threat," unquote. I'd like to take this as a starting point. So when you're talking about the Christian right or the Christian far right, what tendencies are you talking about? And what are some overlaps and distinctions in particular in how they understand patriarchy, gender, and sexuality? Broad brush.
Sure. Well, the reason I led with the comment about the need to stop treating the Christian right as a secondary threat is I think that, on the one hand, the Christian right represents a serious force for right-wing authoritarianism in the United States, but it doesn't fit into the kind of standard categories that people think about when they talk about fascism or fascistic kind of politics. And so it does tend to get less attention and less of a focus from people who see themselves as anti-fascists. In very broad terms, when I talk about the Christian right in the U.S., I'm talking about a kind of a constellation of movements or organizations or networks that came together starting in the 1970s and have really had very impressive staying power and have done a lot of work to build a multi-dimensional movement that includes everything from, lobbying groups and think tanks to just very kind of grassroots prayer cells and neighborhood church networks. And so it's very much kind of a full-scale social movement. In political terms, the Christian right is unified by sort of a broad goal of making their interpretation of Christianity central and dominant to the U.S., but that, certainly means a number of different things. And I would say that in broad terms, there's kind of a division within the movement between what you could characterize as kind of reformist versus revolutionary branches, in quotes, where there's a majority that wants to bring about certain changes within the existing political systems, such as, banning abortion, suppressing homosexuality and gender nonconformity, reintroducing prayer in the schools, bringing back creationism as a, supposedly legitimate field of study, things like this. And then on the other hand, there is a minority faction or current that is nonetheless very powerful and influential that says it's not possible to bring about our vision of ethical Christian society within the existing framework, and so that there is a need, they say, to replace the existing framework with what essentially amounts to a theocracy. And this, in contrast to, say, white nationalists who center their political vision on race, Christian right vision of a kind of theocratic future really puts gender and sexuality at the center rather than race. And it is very much a patriarchal and heterosexist and transphobic vision that is pretty scary. They have a romanticized image of the past, of how, men and women supposedly lived in a harmonious but hierarchical manner, with women, very clearly limited to homemaking roles, wife, mother kinds of roles, and the sex being defined as something that is for procreation, these kinds of standard sort of traditionalist patriarchal ideas. So there are different versions of the theocratic model that they advocate. Some of them are very much based on a centralized big state. Others are actually based on a very decentralized model of state power, which nonetheless is extremely authoritarian and repressive. So it doesn't necessarily all fit together, again, in terms of people's preconceptions about, what far-right authoritarianism looks like.
So it has quite the spectrum. But as you say, like the central crux around which a lot of the political organizing occurs, counterposed to ethno-nationalists who focus on nationality, is this like idea that sex for reproduction, the expansion of the Christian population in the country, the pushing out of ideologies or belief systems that they view as standing in counter to that, and sort of like imposition of theocracy. So that's basically it. So can you talk a little bit about one of the umbrellas that comes up throughout your book is Christian Reconstructionism. At first I was going to kind of glibly compare this to a vision of The Handmaid's Tale, but maybe that's a bit flat. But can you talk about some of the roots of Christian Reconstructionism? And are there analogs with other theocratic or theonomic regimes around the world? And also, big question, all these are. What's Dominionism and how does it relate to Christian Reconstructionism?
Okay. Christian Reconstructionism is a particular ideological current within the Christian right that was founded in the 1960s by R.J. Rushdoony, who was a Presbyterian. In theological terms, it's rooted in certain versions of Presbyterianism, which is originally a branch of Calvinism. But over the decades, it's certainly spread and is not limited to Presbyterians in terms of who its activists and leaders have been. In political terms, it is based on the idea that, as I said, we need to replace the existing political system with a full-on theocracy, or they call it theonomy, based on their interpretation of biblical law. And it is a pretty grim interpretation indeed. I mean, this would involve disenfranchising women, re-legalizing slavery, making the death penalty a punishment for homosexuality or adultery, heresy, and a number of other crimes. And it is a current that has never been a very large movement in its own right, but it is very influential in terms of helping to shape and guide larger forces within the Christian right. For example, Pat Robertson, who was a longtime televangelist and founded the Christian Coalition, which was a major force starting in the 1980s, his approach to politics was very much influenced by Christian Reconstructionism. Similarly, Randall Terry, who founded Operation Rescue as an organization that used civil disobedience tactics in the service of trying to suppress abortion providers and the availability of abortion. He was very much influenced by Christian Reconstructionism. It's a movement that has been particularly influential in the most violent and terroristic wing of the anti-abortion movement. A number of the leading figures in that movement have themselves been proponents of Christian Reconstructionism. And also another person of note is Larry Pratt, who was the longtime head of Gun Owners of America, which has been described as a gun rights organization to the right of the NRA. And Larry Pratt is also somebody who played a significant role in helping to launch the Patriot Militia movement in the 1990s. So these are some examples of the ways that the movement has played a larger role. You also asked about Dominionism. So one of the things that Christian Reconstructionism in particular has advocated is the notion that Christians have a duty to God to, quote unquote, take dominion over society at large and to basically take control over all of the leading institutions of society, from the government to the educational system and the media and so on. And so you started to see in the 70s and later this notion of taking dominion spreading to other forces within the Christian right, and that's where the term dominionism comes from. And there are different versions of that. There's, some people make a distinction between so-called soft dominionism and hard dominionism, depending on how intensive and how comprehensive your notion of imposing a theocratic rule would be. But these are all kind of notions that have become central and defining for the Christian right as a whole in one form or another. And the Christian Reconstructionism, certainly not the only place that they come from, but it's been one of the major influencing pieces of that picture.
And another main wing of the Christian far right that you spend some time on in Insurgent Supremacists is New Apostolic Reformation. Could you talk a little bit about this tendency and sort of how it relates to other branches of Christianity?
Sure. New Apostolic Reformation, it's a movement that it has different names. It's been called Kingdom Now, Seven Mountains Theology, and other names. Again, in theological terms, it's actually rooted in the Pentecostal and charismatic tradition. So this is kind of a whole subset of Christianity that, among other things, believes in the current day practice of miracles, such as faith healing and the availability of prophecy to leaders within the movement who claim to be able to basically give voice to what God has foretold about the future. So within this broad theological current, there are different political currents, but there have been various right-wing tendencies, among others, and they kind of came together, let's say, most clearly starting in the 1990s around this concept of New Apostolic Reformation. And part of what they did is they took some of the Dominionist ideas that came partly from Christian Reconstructionism and combined them with some of the theological and organizational principles from the Pentecostal and charismatic traditions. So the result is something that it resembles Christian Reconstructionism in the sense that it is a theocratic movement. It's a movement that advocates comprehensive control of society and imposition of, again, their version of Christianity on society as a whole. But it's also quite different in certain ways. For one thing, whereas the Christian Reconstructionists advocate this very sort of decentralized model theocracy, the New Apostolic Reformation is very much based on a more centralized version. And it's also been much more effective in galvanizing a mass movement. The numbers are, I haven't seen what I would call reliable numbers, but one estimate from 2013 placed the number of people involved in New Apostolic associated churches in the United States alone at 3 million people, which, with millions more in other countries. It's also very different in terms of its racial and ethnic composition. Christian Reconstructionism, has always been pretty much all white, but the New Apostolic movement has a genuinely multiracial and multi-ethnic character and is also quite international, as I said. With significant branches in Latin America and Asia, Africa. So that's quite different. And the positions that they've taken on issues of race and also actually issues of gender have been, I would say, more sophisticated in a sense. When you look at Christian Reconstructionism, it has tended to either be silent on issues of race or in some cases, some of the leaders have embraced more or less overtly white supremacist positions, for example, supporting neo-Confederate politics, things like this. The New Apostolic Reformation has actually taken a very different approach. There are some leaders within the movement who advocate quote-unquote colorblind ideology of, basically claiming to just treat everybody as an individual. But there are others who actually advocate confronting and opposing racial injustice, at least, within some context or, at least in words. So that in itself is very different. And while Christian Reconstructionism has always been very male-dominated in terms of who is actually seen as having the capacity to be in leadership roles, New Apostolic Reformation has, from the beginning, included women in prominent roles and important leadership roles, and to some degree has been a space where women have been able to speak out against male domination and to challenge misogynistic interpretations of Christianity. And I think it's important to be careful about this because, to my view, it's not that these characteristics make New Apostolic Reformation more progressive or, somehow less dangerous. Rather, it's an example of a far-right movement taking elements of progressive or, even radical politics and distorting them and harnessing them for goals and purposes that are fundamentally reactionary or right-wing or fascistic, and thereby deflecting a lot of criticism and also channeling some of the kinds of frustrations and rebelliousness that people may have, channeling that into initiatives that end up bolstering hierarchy and bolstering oppression. I mean, the New Apostolic Reformation leaders may, in some cases, speak out against racial injustice, but they're also speaking out against abortion rights. They're speaking out in favor of transphobic laws and just all kinds of suppression of any kind of gender nonconformity. And they've been very outspoken in supporting Donald Trump's politics and just the whole, make America great again kind of approach to politics. So it's not in any sense a progressive movement, but again, rather something that uses elements of progressive politics in a very dangerous way.
Yeah, it in fact sounds quite regressive. I think you made the point in the book, unless I'm mistaken, and I don't have the page number, but of jumping back to what you were saying about the occasional courting of racial supremacist perspectives by Christian Reconstructionism. They're like, just to put a point on the position of them working with neo-Confederates at times. Can you talk a little bit, I guess, about the sort of historical vision that they in particular, but either of the groups have of not only what the United States or iterations within the United States, such as the antebellum South, or what the vision of America was to be as a city on a hill or as an example of puritanical institution, because it seems like they're sort of trying to make what their vision of America being great again is theonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the phrase puritanical is, it's a good one. I mean, in the sense that, the Puritans, some of the founders of American settler colonialism back in the 17th century, the Puritans were Calvinists who were theological relatives of the founders of Christian Reconstructionism in the sense of their vision of society being something that was based in certain notions of obedience to God's law and so on. I think that, as I said, there are different versions of the visions that these groups have, with the Reconstructionists having a very decentralized approach. I mean, basically, their notion is that the theocracy would be exercised through the family, through the church, through local institutions, primarily, with central governmental institutions, playing much more of a secondary role. Whereas the New Apostolic Reformation, and I think some of the other forces within the Christian right, take much more of a big state kind of approach. And I should mention that the New Apostolic Reformation has also cultivated some pretty active ties with prominent politicians, folks such as Sarah Palin, former vice presidential candidate, Rick Perry, who was governor of Texas and then was in Trump's cabinet, Sam Brownback, who was a senator and governor from Kansas, and other folks. So even though they have this comprehensive vision of basically getting rid of the, system of government that the U.S. has, they also have done a lot to kind of work with politicians who are involved in the system.
So in Insurgent Supremacists, you decided not to cover reactionary Roman Catholicism because it's not a distinctly U.S.-based movement. But as an ex-Catholic myself, despite a sense of falling numbers of membership in the church, it seems like there are a rise in right-wing strains, such as those which produce people like Steve Bannon or Amy Coney Barrett, or historically, the trajectory of Father Charles Coughlin and his National Union of Social Justice back in the 1930s. Do you see any ascendant reactionary Roman Catholicism as one of these other groups that are posing a threat? And do you see in that an influence from a renewed Christian charismatic movement, or does it seem like it's just the same monster coming back, the same reactionary Catholicism?
Well, I think certainly reactionary Catholicism has played a significant role within the broader Christian right in its current form. all along. And, as you say, there are much older roots. I mean, Charles Coughlin in the 1930s was one of the most, if not the most, influential leaders of what was really a fascist movement at that time in the U.S. And it was striking that as a Catholic priest at a time when anti-Catholicism was still a major force within the U.S. and certainly within sectors of the far right. So carrying that forward, during the period of the Cold War, there were a number of right-wing Catholic leaders who, in some cases, had ties with right-wing Catholic forces within or in exile from Eastern Europe, under the Soviet bloc. So there is a distinct tradition of right-wing Catholicism that is, being invoked or being built upon by right-wing Catholics today. I think that one of the things that's been distinctive about the modern Christian right has been its ability to build bridges and alliances between right-wing Protestants and Catholics, in contrast to earlier movements that were often separated and, where, as I said, anti-Catholicism was often a major force and was interconnected with anti-immigrant sentiment targeting first Irish Catholics, but then later, Italians and other immigrant groups. But the Christian right has really been successful at setting those and other kind of sectarian divisions aside for political purposes. So you have seen a number of organizations such as Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition, for example, which might be majority Protestant, but, with significant Catholic presence within it. And then you've also had other organizations which are specifically Catholic, thinking, for example, of the Human Life International, which has been a leading Catholic anti-abortion group for a number of decades, and others. And it's interesting, there have been a number of prominent right-wing evangelical Protestants who've actually converted to Catholicism, such as Sam Brownback, who I mentioned earlier, the political leader from Kansas. I'm interested to learn more about Amy Coney Barrett. I confess that I haven't really delved into her political history that much, but I know that she comes out of a organization called People of Praise, which is a Catholic charismatic group. So charismatic being a movement within Christianity that cuts across the division between Protestants and Catholics, but People of Praise being specifically a Catholic group within that, and one that I believe has had significant ties with leaders within the New Apostolic Reformation movement. So I don't know that it would be accurate to say that Amy Coney Barrett herself is affiliated with New Apostolic Reformation. I've never heard that claim made, but there are certainly some, at least indirect connections, and I'm sure some significant resonances between her politics and theirs. So I think there's definitely some things there, a number of threads that would be important to explore further.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
You're listening to Dissident Island Radio.
Live every first and third Friday of the month at 9 p.m. GMT.
Check out www.dissidentisland.org for downloads and more.
Neighbors, no one loves you like he loves you. And no cares like he cares. Neighbors, let us join today in the holy love of God and money. Because neighbors, no one loves you like he loves you. And what better way to show your love than to dig deep into your pockets? Dig real deep and give until it hurts. Alleviate your guilt. Free yourself once again because he gave to you, brothers and sisters. Please give a $10, $25, or $50 tax-deductible donation, and I assure you your modest pledge will be used to censor TV and radio, ban questionable books, and contribute to many other godly services. No longer will young Christian Americans hedonistically indulge in masochistic submission to rhythmic music, or with your monetary support, there is no end to what we can achieve in this country. The voice of God is government. The voice of God is government. The voice of God is government. In God we trust. Can't you see what we believe in? Our thoughts and our reason, pursuit of life and liberty. Happiness we cannot taste, because truth of the mighty voice of God is all your real choice. I am in the change of law, sex and serve with one small bar. The voice of God is government. The voice of God is government. The voice of God is government. Government! If we show God and Jesus Christ, religious love is sacrifice. Love for God is shown cash. Nothing left, fill my trash. And repent that we receive our money is that for God's needs. Build $1 million church, money spent on God's search. Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government. Government! Late night TV, God can heal a certain voice you cannot feel. Love for money and God's name, which is not what TV gave. Money spent on God's return. Money spent on God's return. Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government. Government! Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government.
This is the Final Straw Radio, and you're hearing a conversation with anti-fascist author Matthew Lyons on Christian nationalist movements in the so-called USA. I'd be interested in hearing how you think the concept of liberty is espoused by many of these tendencies, and that also simultaneously are trying to lead a coordinated movement towards theocracy. For instance, I recall adherents to the right-wing Libertarian Party used to make stances of being socially liberal. This is like at least when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, like around drug use or around sexuality, in a way that seemed to set them apart from others on the right. And, you know, that was something they touted. They were really proud of that. But it seems like the libertarian movement has sort of, a lot of people in the libertarian movement have embraced this sort of theocratic vision. So if you could talk a little bit about how does the concept, to your understanding of liberty, coincide with implementing God's will?
Well, I think libertarianism is a term that covers a number of different kind of political approaches or different philosophies. But there's a long-standing, certainly several decades old relationship between libertarianism and Christian Reconstructionism specifically. There were a number of important founding leaders of Christian Reconstructionism, such as R.J. Rushdoony, who I mentioned earlier, and Gary North, another important leader, who were involved in libertarian organizations early in their careers and in conjunction with the development of Reconstructionist ideology. And I think the connection there is basically the idea of limited government. You know, the Reconstructionists have been dubbed libertarian theocrats because, again, they want to impose their theocratic rule through small-scale governmental institutions as well as non-governmental institutions such as the family and the church. But at the same time, their notion of liberty it's based on the idea that humans must submit themselves to God's authority, and any attempt to, develop ideas or lines of thinking that are outside of that any such effort is sinful, is wrong, is satanic. And so it just really kind of calls into question, what are we even talking about when we talk about liberty? But, I'm sure they would argue that, it is a kind of liberty, but it's not a concept of liberty that seems meaningful to me. I think that I'm sure there are others within the Christian right who would stop short of this very hardline notion of submission to God's will, but that is a concept that you do see in watered down versions in other places too.
So another point in Insurgent Supremacists, which I think is, I really enjoy the construction, the way that you put chapters sort of leading one into another and to show about the relationships between far-right movements. You kind of point out how the Patriot Movement grew in part out of the racial supremacist right and groups such as Posse Comitatus, and later gaining an infusion of Christian fundamentalist perspectives in a uniquely American manner. Can you talk about how the Christian far right relates to current tendencies such as like sovereign citizens, or more importantly, things like constitutional sheriffs? And how does this devolution of civil authority, how does it relate to the concept of democracy?
Well, I want to just correct a little bit of what you said there, in that, to me, the Christian right influence was there from the very beginning in the formation of the Patriot Movement. It wasn't something that came later. I mean, the Patriot Movement kind of came to prominence in the early to mid-1990s with the formation of hundreds of so-called citizen militias and related groups around the country that were spurred on by fears that there was a plot by globalist elites who were trying to, impose a dictatorship on the United States. And so people needed to rise up and defend themselves against it. And a lot of critics of this movement have emphasized the ways that it carried forward ideas and currents rooted in white nationalism and rooted in neo-Nazi and white supremacist movements of the years that came earlier. And that's an important part of it. But the Christian right forces, and specifically Christian Reconstructionists, were also there, right from the beginning. I mean, Larry Pratt, who I mentioned earlier, was the leader of Gun Owners of America and an advocate of Reconstructionist ideas about politics. He was advocating the formation of citizen militias in the 1980s, so well before anybody was talking about, them in the national media. Matt Trewhella, another Reconstructionist leader, he advocated forming citizen militias in the context of the anti-abortion rights movement in the early 1990s. So these were very much present from the beginning as part of the mix that created the Patriot Movement as a hybrid, a blending of a number of different right-wing currents. And that is something that has carried through to the current day version. I mean, the Patriot Movement has had its ups and downs. It had a big upsurge in the 1990s, and it kind of collapsed for a number of years. And it had another upsurge starting, at least partly in response to the election of Barack Obama as the first Black president of the United States. And it's continued to be a significant force, since then. But currents within the Patriot Movement, such as the sovereign citizens, which is a particular branch of patriot ideology that claims that each person can kind of, in legal terms, be sort of a country unto themselves, and they can sort of declare that they are, no longer subject to United States authority. This is very much rooted in the mix of white nationalist and Christian theocratic ideas, along with other right-wing ideas that came out of, the gun rights movement, that came out of the anti-environmental movement, came out of the John Birch Society as a Cold War era champion of conspiracist ideology, all these kind of different currents coming together. The Sovereign Citizens is one offshoot of that. The Constitutional Sheriffs organization, which I think was founded about 10 or 12 years ago, has become an important Patriot Movement organization. The founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs, Richard Mack, is actually somebody who worked for Gun Owners of America along with Larry Pratt. So that doesn't necessarily mean that he had exactly the same views, but I'm sure that, they would have had some pretty interesting political discussions there in which Christian Reconstructionist ideas would have certainly been in the mix. So I think that, these are all examples of just the kind of interplay that, we've had between Christian theocratic political currents and other kind of far-right political forces within the Patriot Movement and in other contexts.
So you've made the point that many of the far-right Christian movements you've been talking about often center patriarchy and religion over race as a central crux within it, which distinguishes them from other elements in the U.S. far right. You've mentioned also that the New Apostolic Reformation is a much less blanket white movement, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your understanding of how this tendency or how the far-right Christian movements in general, like to sort of broad brush, deal with immigration in the U.S. I know that a lot of the anti-Catholic perspectives on the West Coast have formulated around fears of immigrants from Latin America bringing in Catholicism, for instance, and like the social values that they believe are carried with that. But yeah, do you see like a shift in the way that the Christian far right has been thinking about immigration and how it relates to like the ethno-nationalist tendencies in other parts of the U.S. far right?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that it's been a kind of a complicated story. My sense is that for much of its earlier history, the Christian right didn't really focus on issues of immigration and was not particularly aligned with anti-immigrant scapegoating. So I'm talking about the 1970s through maybe the 1990s or so. And certainly during that time, you did start to see significant anti-immigrant organizing kind of coming back into the fore. I mean, it's been, kind of this recurrent theme in U.S. history, but that was a period when it was starting to be on the upsurge again. But initially, the Christian right was, really not playing to that theme. But after some time, I'm not sure exactly when, but, sometime in the early 2000s, that started to shift, and you started to see much more use of anti-immigrant scapegoating by sections of the Christian right because they saw it as something that was popular with their base or the potential support base that they were trying to appeal to. So they saw it as something that would, help win them support. At the same time, they've also been interested in reaching out to immigrants themselves in many cases, whether we're talking about Catholics or evangelicals coming from Latin America or coming from other parts of the world. There are significant groups there that the Christian right has seen as, people that they could hope to attract. And in the case of New Apostolic Reformation, they've been pretty successful to a degree at doing that. So that's a particular section of the Christian right that, as far as I can tell, has really steered clear of anti-immigrant scapegoating themselves. There may be exceptions, but I think that's generally been the case, which is not to say that their politics have been good around immigrant rights. They've been, perfectly amenable to working with others within the right who have, pretty odious politics around immigration, but it's just, something that they would not necessarily promote themselves. So there is kind of this complicated dance that some of these groups have tried to follow, because there are essentially conflicting aims or conflicting demands on them, in terms of how they could build their base or, reach out to more people.
So you did use the term at one point, Christian fascism, when talking about Coughlin and the movement that he was involved with. And I've been hearing that term coming up a lot recently, or Christofascism. One figure that I can think of that would fall into that tendency that I wanted to mention is the former Ashevillean William Dudley Pelley and his silver shirt movement in the 1930s and I think 40s. Is Christian fascism an apt term to describe, a useful term to describe any of the groups that you've been talking about today in this conversation?
Well, it depends what we mean by fascism. I mean, I think there's no general agreement about what fascism is within the left, let alone more broadly in society. I think that there's kind of a common sense notion of fascism that many people have, in which white supremacist ideology is kind of a major piece of the picture. So if that is part of your definition of fascism, then a lot of the Christian right is not going to fit that. To me, I think it's more useful to use the term fascism somewhat more broadly. I mean, to me, fascism is an approach to politics that is about mobilizing, or trying to mobilize, masses of people in an effort to, on the one hand, bolster or intensify systems of oppression and social hierarchy, but also to challenge the established political order and the established political elites. So it has both a oppressive and a rebellious aspect. But to me, it does not necessarily have to center on race. It does not necessarily have to center on intensifying racial oppression and racist ideology in a direct way. So I would argue that the section of the Christian right that advocates not just specific changes such as outlawing abortion or bringing back school prayer, but advocates a more comprehensive transformation of society based on an authoritarian political vision, I think it's appropriate to call that fascist. But we need to be clear what we mean when we use the term. Otherwise, it just becomes kind of this epithet that gets thrown around. So if that concept of fascism makes sense to you, then I would say use it that way. But if your concept of fascism is more specific to, a white nationalist vision, then it doesn't fit for most of the Christian right, except for that, limited section of the Christian right that directly supports white nationalism.
So you've advocated anti-fascists focusing on the battleground of gender and bodily autonomy as anti-fascists. Notably, Anti-Racist Action took that stance from the 1990s onward in defending abortion clinics as another front of liberation struggles. So in terms of strategy, in terms of anti-fascists approaching theocratic movements, Christian far-right movements, and trying to counter them, I wonder, what do you think that we're missing in the approach or in these conversations that we're having about how we can combat the toxic spread of theocracy? Some of the strongest advocates that I've met in just anecdotally in my life have been people that have escaped from homeschooling situations or from quiverful families or what have you. And I think that there's something there to work with, but I wonder what you have to say as far as the movement goes.
Well, I guess there's a couple sort of broad things I would say about anti-fascist strategy in this context. First off, one is that, coming back to the point where we started this conversation, it's important for anti-fascists not to treat the Christian right as a secondary issue, which I think it's tied in with this question of what's the role of race versus other points of, issues of social oppression, and what does fascism center on? I mean, to me, the white nationalist vision of creating an all-white homeland, whether that's through migration or mass expulsion or genocide, those are all horrific visions that need to be combated, no question. At the same time, the kind of political vision that Christian theocrats put forward of a society where everybody is subordinate to their version of Christian ideology, and that is something that comes down with particular severity on women, on queer folks, on trans folks, even if it is not directly targeting people of color. That in itself is a horrific vision, and it's something that needs to be combated on its own terms, and not only if it is something that is seen as supporting a white nationalist vision. So I think that in terms of just where do people on the left and within anti-fascist circles, where do people see the major sources of danger and political threat coming from, it's important to pay attention to Christian theocratic forces, especially because, some of these forces are enormous. I mentioned earlier that there's an estimate of the New Apostolic Reformation having something in the order of 3 million supporters in the United States. I mean, even if that's off by an order of magnitude, that's still enormous. And it's far, far greater than groups such as the Oath Keepers or Constitutional Sheriffs or the Proud Boys, let alone any of the sort of smaller neo-Nazi groups that are out there. And it's not just numbers, but it's also the organization and the funding and the degree of commitment that, people in these movements display. So these are serious, serious opponents that we need to contend with. The other broad point I want to make about anti-fascist strategy, to me, that it's important to approach this in terms of kind of a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, it's important for us to work with a variety of political forces, people with a variety of political views, to build broad anti-fascist alliances, broad alliances to combat the far right in different contexts, whether that's in terms of, mass protests in the media, different contexts. And also, the other approach is it is equally necessary to have radical initiatives that are confronting and seeking to change the kind of systemic oppression and exploitation and institutional violence that's at the heart of how our society is organized. And these two approaches are, sometimes seen as in opposition to each other, or that we need to subordinate one to the other. And, I think that may be true in, specific moments and specific contexts, but overall, they're both important. And we need to find ways to pursue both of them. The far right is an immediate danger in terms of it's something that presents an immediate threat to many of us, to a number of different communities, So there is that kind of immediacy that's needed, a need to push against that. But the far right is also rooted in, the kind of systemic oppression and just the kind of social order that gives rise to supremacist ideologies in different kinds. And so unless we attack that systemic reality, it's just going to keep coming back. And another side of it is also, I mentioned earlier that the far right has this combination of trying to intensify oppression, but also rebelling against the status quo, rebelling against the established elites and the established institutions. And that means that it's a political force that feeds on people's anger at elites. It feeds on people's sense of being beaten down and disenfranchised. And if the left wants to present a serious alternative as an oppositional force, it needs to offer an alternative. It needs to offer radical visions that speak to people's sense of disempowerment and people's anger, rather than simply take a kind of a defensive posture. So I think, again, there are ways that it's important in specific moments or specific contexts to join together around just sort of holding actions, but it would be a real mistake to just put any kind of notion of radical social change on the back burner, or say that, that's something we can't really afford to address at this time of, a resurgent right. It would be self-defeating to take that approach of pure defensiveness. So as far as the question of, you made the point about refugees from far-right communities, or, people who've sort of been raised in a Christian theocratic context. How do we engage with them, or how do we provide, space for them to take a different path? I certainly think that's an important question. I don't know that I have any particular insights into that, except that, as with anyone, it's important to take seriously the experiences that people have had and let people tell their stories and engage with them in a way that's based on respect. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people who've just come out of a corporal community, have it all figured out. But, let's listen to what they have to say, and let's engage with them from the standpoint that people go into these movements for reasons that are human. It's not that they're simply brainwashed, or, that it's based on, madness or something like that. Right-wing movements attract people because they speak to the needs or the desires or the fears that people have. And those are very human things. And we have to find other ways to speak to people in human terms that don't talk down to them, that don't dismiss their realities, but offer a framework that respects all people and is about seeking human liberation rather than, a supremacist vision of the future.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a very big subject you've been talking about. I've had you on for a while. My questions have kind of been a little scattered and trying to pick at a few different angles. But I'm wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask about that you want to touch on as we wrap this up.
I'm drawing a blank right now.
Cool.
There probably is, but I'm drawing a blank.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation and for all the research that you do. How can listeners follow and support your work?
Well, thanks again for having me on. As you mentioned, I have a book that came out a few years ago, Insurgent Supremacists, the U.S. Far Right's Challenge to State and Empire. It was published by PM Press and Chris Blebeda Publishing. I contribute regularly to the blog Three-Way Fight, which is threewayfight.blogspot.com. And I have, a website, MatthewNLyons.net, where people can find listings for my various writings. So thanks again, and I appreciate the good work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. As to support for our project, we are entering a period of recording fury. Patreon supporters will get early access to interviews as we get them edited down, as well as behind-the-scenes conversations between the producers. Upcoming releases include Mitchell Verder, co-author of the 2005 AK Press book Dreams of Freedom, a Ricardo Flores Magón reader, speaking about the 100th anniversary of the murder by incarceration by the U.S. state of the Mexican anarcho-communist revolutionary, RFM, and a discussion of his legacy. Another conversation that we have coming up for release is Rhiannon Firth Taylor on her recently published book, Disaster Anarchy, Mutual Aid and Radical Action, out from Pluto Press. And you can find our Patreon at patreon.com/TFSR. Though we're releasing some content early to Patreon supporters, we won't be paywalling it permanently. Our fundraising goes to operating costs, equipment, and paying our transcribers. We've been transcribing each interview we've conducted and making them available as zines on our website for coming up on 2 years now, and going back to transcribe past episodes to boot. This makes important conversations available for translation for easier access to folks who are more comfortable reading or for whom English is a second language, as well as getting the content more easily into the prisons, for reading groups, and into passers-by's hands so as to include more people in this discussion. For other ways that you can support the project monetarily, there are merch and donation options at tfsr.wtf/support. And for non-money support, we could always use ratings on Apple, Google, and Amazon Podcasts so that those who are not in the know can become in the know more easily thanks to the algorithms. Or you could also mention and boost our social media, including our Mastodon and Castopod instances. Examples of our streams and social media can be found at tfsr.wtf. Telling others IRL, in real life, about this project is also a great way to expand our audience. And if you have a story that you'd like to hear covered, you can always find contact for us on our website as well. Finally, if you have a community or college radio station that you'd like to hear our weekly free 58-minute episode air on, for any weirdo with an antenna and a receiver to pick up, help us out by visiting tfsr.wtf/radio to learn more. Thank you for the support. And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a
In late October, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul, was attacked in their San Francisco home. The attacker was a right-wing wackadoodle, reportedly with a number of anti-Semitic online posts. He appears to be a QAnon fan and an election denier. He struck Paul Pelosi in the head with a hammer. A hammer. So before anything else, in light of this escalating violence, I think we all have a responsibility to advocate for a peaceful world. I think that particularly falls to me because of my consistent advocacy for political violence. So to promote peace, I've asked Burse to insert about 30 seconds of a peace song from 1962 that I feel is one of the most memorable and poignant clarion calls for peace ever written. So please take a moment to reflect on the sentiments of this song.
If I had a hammer, I'd a hammer in the morning, I'd a hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd a hammer out danger, I'd a hammer out a warning, I'd a hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters, all over this land. Ooh.
Okay, just kidding. Political violence is a normalized element of American life, particularly extreme right-wing violence against people of color and the LGBTQ+ community. But now we suddenly have calls for drastic change because Paul Pelosi got smacked in the head with a hammer. Lawmakers are insisting that more taxpayer money must be spent on security for lawmaker families, while Senator Amy Klobuchar has proposed measures for punishing not just those who post online hate speech, but criminalizing others as well. As to money for security for lawmakers' families, think about this. Paul and Nancy Pelosi are worth an estimated $300 million. Shouldn't anyone worth $300 million already have their own home security? If you have that kind of money and you're too cheap to get a home security system installed in your palatial home, perhaps a good smack in the head with a hammer is a necessary wake-up call. If you have that kind of money and no home security, that means you're stupid. And I don't think large amounts of taxpayer money needs to be spent protecting stupid, rich, cheap people. Let these stupid, rich, cheap people and their families pool their money and buy a pistol the way poor people do. And as to the proposed measures to further limit and criminalize online speech, that's just more of the same fascist control freak nonsense that drives Americans to want to get violent in the first place. Paul Pelosi wasn't smacked in the head with a tweet, he was smacked in the head with a hammer. Limiting free speech, even advocacy for political violence, which we need more of, not less, only limits the venues for nonviolent expression and increases the potential for folks acting out rather than blowing off steam. And this leads us to confront the real problem. The real problem is people are hurting and they're suffering. They feel unheard and unseen. And there's a growing fear, a growing rage, and a growing resentment that people harbor toward those in charge. For decades and centuries, the two corporate political parties have rolled out the same tired retread solutions that make our world worse rather than better, squabbling, alternating power back and forth and back and forth, a perpetual swindle offering hope and change that never come. Not to say I share this attacker's political views, because what I've heard about him sounds pretty reprehensible. But we have these moments, occasional benchmarks that signal a rising tide of discontent, not directed for a change at black or brown bodies or gender non-conforming bodies, but directed at multimillionaires with power and prestige. And their first inclination isn't to radically alter the way they exercise power and make our lives better. Their response is to increase the chasm between themselves and the disgruntled rabble, further barricade themselves in the hopes that we can't get our hands on them and we all just turn on each other. Perhaps if they didn't create a dystopian world, they wouldn't be finding themselves in charge of a dystopian world. I'm reminded of footage of Fidel Castro during the Bay of Pigs in 1961. The U.S. had attempted an illegal invasion of Cuba, and Castro, then president of Cuba, was on the beach handing out rifles to Cuban people who had shown up to defend their island from invasion. Castro had no security, handing loaded rifles to random strangers, and nobody shot him. Nobody. Could Biden or Trump do that today? Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell? Could you imagine any of those leaders without Secret Service in any random American community handing out loaded rifles to strangers? I can't. And so I have to wonder if this circumstance is caused by all of us being deranged and violent and wrong, or if it's caused by the aforementioned deserving our scorn and our outrage, and yes, maybe even our violence. If you can't stand on a beach and hand out rifles to strangers the way Castro did, maybe it's you. And so, perhaps in our struggle, there are many tools we can employ for our own empowerment. A standard tool found in just about any toolbox is the common hammer. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org. This is The Final Straw. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.